warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Evening. We are ready to start. Firstly, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome everybody to the PMI event. Can we fill in the gaps, please? There's quite a few gaps that are appearing. I've been asked to ask people to move forward because we expect. Can you hear me at the back?
I can now.
Right. We expect people to attend as the event proceeds. So if you can try to fill in the gaps as possible. Welcome, as I said, to the PMI event, Professional Muslim Institute. My name is Yunus Lunat. I'm a solicitor, head the Employment Law Department at Hyson Harrison in Leeds. I've been attending these events for probably a couple of years. Many of familiar faces here. Welcome to new attendees who've not attended before. Normally, we would expect probably double the number of people that are here. It seems that we are also engaging in Christmas festivities, and that's probably the reason why the turnout isn't as brilliant. But having said that, well done for attending on a difficult evening, conditions-wise, and understandably people do want to go away, and it's still a tremendous turnout. Can I thank Javid Bashir, who organises these events. Javid's, everybody will know Javid by now, who set up PMI 2 years ago. The aim, the vision was to bring together professional peoples from similar backgrounds, Muslims and non-Muslims with diversity, to enable networking and showcasing best practice and leading role models in our community. Since its launch, there has, at the University of Bradford some 2 or 3 years ago, there was a further launch at the House of Lords, which was attended by well over 100 guests, which was hosted by Baroness Afshar. Over the last certainly 2 years that I've been attending, but even before then, PMI have held a number of dinners and events and invited a number of key speakers and dignitaries to attend. Examples being the last event, Lord Nazir Ahmed. We've had Zia Chaudhry, who is a secret millionaire, Lord Mayor Khadim Hussain, Azhar Siddiqui, the apprentice, Christian Bakker, the former MTV DJ who wrote the book From MTV to Mecca. We've had George Galloway here. Nazir Afzal was a tremendous evening, very well attended evening, very entertaining as well. He was the Chief Crown Prosecutor in the Northwest. We've had Inspector Kiza Dinsa, Professor Misbah Deen, Adil Rashid, the Yorkshire cricketer, Lord Mayor of Bradford, Nabila Akhtar, Rizwanul Haq, the comedian Zef Mirza, the list goes on. We've had some very entertaining and engaging guests. Over the course of the 2 years, the PMI the events have been attended by conservatively well over 1,200 delegates, various professions, backgrounds from around the country. The event has attracted delegates from as far afield as Newcastle, Middlesbrough, Birmingham, Sheffield, Manchester, Bolton, Preston, and it's increasing all the time. As well as obviously the local people that are regulars that make the event that it is. It's meeting people, making friends. I've made not only business connections, but many friends here as well, who we keep contact with. PMI aims to address wider issues affecting the community as a whole and showcase positive role models in the community. We have one of those today in Zia Chaudhry, who is our guest speaker today. I'll be introducing very shortly. PMI has also been approached by various other colleagues from around the country to spread the good work, the positive work that's been done, which has not gone unnoticed. And there are plans to hold similar events in Manchester, Birmingham and London, I'm informed. So watch this space. PMI, by the way, does not receive any funding from any source at all, and is self-generating. It generates its own revenue through the subsidies, the subscriptions that we pay for the dinner tickets, and voluntary work that is put in, largely by Javid Bashir, who does a lot of work behind the scenes. And in order to take the event forward, certainly PMI would welcome anybody interested in sponsoring future events, from businesses So do speak to Javid, who's around certainly. As it's ever growing and expenditure is increasing, one of the aims is to develop an interactive website to enable increased networking to take place. And if there is anyone on hand who's a dab hand at networks, computers and the like, and help developing the website beyond what it already is, please do offer your services to Javid. Now, without further ado, I want to introduce our guest. That's why we're all here. Our guest is Zia Chaudhry today. Zia was born in Burnley in Lancashire. At the age of 6, he moved to Liverpool. Now, although he comes from a Pakistani background, he is very much a product of Britain, and therefore, I would say, conveniently placed to offer thought into both cultures. Having been a pupil at the Liverpool Bluecoat School, he went on to graduate from Manchester University and was called to the bar in 1991. That's two things, as we're speaking to Zia, we have in common. I also graduated from Manchester in 1990 as well, but unfortunately the poor relations, I went to the Polytechnic. For the younger kids who just make sure you've got your passes here, it's called Metro now, the Metropolitan University, not the Metro newspaper. Zia brought up in Liverpool. The other thing we have in common is we're both Reds. First thing I asked him is, are you blue or are you red? So we're on friendly terms now. Now, he's been practicing as a barrister, specialising in criminal law now for more than 20 years. Aside from the legal practice, what he's here to talk to us about is the work that Zia does in interfaith dialogue. That Zia has been engaged in interfaith dialogue for well over a decade now, during which time he has addressed a variety of audiences, including the judiciary, school pupils, the criminal users of the criminal justice system, undergraduates at Cambridge University, and assorted church groups. He was chair of the Merseyside Council of Faith from 2005 until 2008, and a founding member of the Northwest Faith Forum, as well as being involved in other interfaith groups. He featured as part of the ITV series Soul to Soul, which is hosted by Joe Brand, and he has also appeared numerously in the media, in radio appearances, discussing Islam and related issues, which has never really been out of the media spotlight for the last certainly 20 years or so. So he's very well placed to comment on those issues. He has spoken at a Christian-Muslim seminar at the European Union as well, and is acutely aware of the need to expand interfaith dialogue. Most recently, he's become a trustee of the Gladstone Library, having been involved in the library's successful initiative to open the country's first Islamic reading room. He's here to talk to us tonight about his book. Signed copies will be available. Just Your Average Muslim. Now, if I could just say, today's event has been subsidised for £15 in the hope that it's been subsidised in the hope that we will purchase the book, which is available, as I say, signed copies. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Zia Chaudhry.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Can I firstly check that you can hear me at the back? Yes. It's a good start. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you all for attending tonight when you could have been at home watching the Christmas movies, and instead you braved the weather and came to listen to me. I'm glad I came as well, and I'm glad that I didn't follow Javed's suggestion and try and come down the chimney. Well, I'm here obviously to promote a book that I've written, but I'll come to that in a short while. But I thought I'd start off with some positives, because we rarely hear positive things about Islam and Muslims. So I wanted to start by applying my mind to perhaps some things that Muslims were good at. Well, we're good at worship, I think. We're very devout and conscious of our prayers and our prayer times. And I would venture to suggest that there are few people, few communities in the world who worship as much as we do. We are very good at observing the rituals of our faith. The smallest details, we're often very clued up about the requirements. We know, for example, how many times we need to say a particular dua to get into heaven. We've got all those statistics at the forefront of our minds. To be fair, we are also very good at being charitable. In particular, in the month of Ramadan, our hearts and our hands are opened and we donate generously. Just a brief look around this room shows what else we're good at. Some of the best solicitors, lawyers in Yorkshire, if not the country, are sat right here. Some of the best business people originate from Bradford. Success stories that, we're talking about, let's say, restaurants, for example, and sometimes in Manchester or even in Liverpool. Liverpool has a very small Pakistani community, but there are restaurants there that have started their lives in Bradford. So in business, we are good, successful. But despite these successes, I felt there was something missing. I felt there was a gap in my life. And not a personal gap, but a gap as a Muslim. Something related to Islam was missing. I felt that Muslims were in need. In need of what? Respect and dignity are two things that are not often associated with the way we conduct ourselves in the world. Power is something that we certainly miss. I certainly think that Islam as a force in the world is often powerless. Security and peace, those are things that don't seem to be readily associated with Islam and Muslims. I want Islam to mean something, to be understood by others. And yet, the more I look at the reporting in the media, the more I come to realize that clearly it's not being understood. It's very much misunderstood. So that is a sense of loss, me being part of something that nobody else seems to understand. And if anything, they've got some very warped views about it. I think also we need to understand what other people think about us. Islam isn't about having a head in the sand approach and being oblivious to the concerns of others. There is a football club called Millwall, and they're famous for having hooligans. And one of their songs, one of their chants at their football games was, "No one likes us, we don't care." And sometimes I think, is that the approach that some Muslims have adopted? The whole world hates us, we're not bothered. Because if it is, we should be bothered. We should be concerned and interested in other people's legitimate concerns about us. Don't get me wrong, I'm the first person to criticize sections of the media when they sensationalize some negative story that relates to Islam and Muslims. But there are other concerns that aren't so negative, and they might be concerns of our neighbours, our work colleagues, who see these negative media depictions, but they feel a bit embarrassed. They're not going to ask us, is that what you really believe? They might be pleasantly surprised if they did, but it's hard for certain people to come forward and ask the questions, but they may well have legitimate concerns. We all know that the Daily Mail makes things up about Muslims don't want to celebrate Christmas, they want to change the name of Christmas, etc., etc. And often it was found out later that these were fabricated stories, they were completely false. Since I was a child, I've loved Christmas. I don't know any Muslim who doesn't. If for no other reason than at the very least you get to watch a lot of telly and have some time off. What's wrong with that? And presents? Who's ever complained of presents? But myths develop, and sometimes people's legitimate concerns are overshadowed. But it's important that they're not overshadowed for this reason. We should care about those legitimate concerns, because if people in Britain, or anywhere for that matter, have a negative view about us as Muslims, doesn't take a great leap then to have negative views about our faith, our religion, and anybody who's got negative views about Islam and Muslims is hardly likely to have a positive view of the Muslims' God. Now, we believe in one God, but a lot of people out there don't even realize that it's the same God that they believe in. They hear Muslims talk about Allah and think, well, that's something completely different. And it's for us to address these misconceptions. But as I say, if they've got negative views about us and our religion, they're not going to have positive views about our Creator. And the way I look at it is that one day I'll be questioned about that. God reminds us He doesn't need our prayers, He doesn't need us. But if we've in any way contributed to negative views about Him, won't we be called to account for that? But look, the way you conducted yourself while you were on earth, you were oblivious to what anybody else thought, because you said, oh, they've got it wrong, misconceptions. They're always peddling negative stories about Islam and Muslims. Well, that's all well and good. What did you do to give them positive stories? Nothing. You had your head in the sand at best. You let the negativity spread, and the upshot of it all was that such a huge tranche of people had no respect for me, their Creator. And I personally think that I will be accountable for any role that I've played in that. And so for that reason alone, I should be concerned what other people think about Islam and Muslims. I also need to understand, we need to understand, what is the purpose of Islam. Yes, we've got the ritual sorted out. We can tick boxes like nobody else. I've said my prayers today, I've done my fasting for this year, I've given my 2.5%, I'm well on the way to heaven. The daily prayers, all of them, don't take more than an hour. So that leaves 23 hours of every single day. What are they for? The fasting has been prescribed to you as it was prescribed to those before you for a month. What's with the other 11 months? It's about the effort that humans are expected to make. Because otherwise, surely Islam does become, like other religions, the opium of the masses. It's just used as something to dull people's senses. At best, it's used as a plaster. There's a gaping wound, and we stick a plaster on it with some sort of Islamic label and think that our problems are being solved. We need to understand the role of Islam. Why did our Creator take the trouble of sending all these messengers? Why did he take the trouble of over 23 years, bit by bit, revealing his word as guidance for us, a guidance and a blessing? Why would he do that? If it was just about, well, say your 5 prayers and that's all you need to worry about. He could have said that much in a day, never mind 23 years. And these things often don't have obvious answers, but that's the point. We need to ask ourselves the questions. Why wasn't it the case that in those 23 years God revealed the 10 million commandments? Because he could have done, but he didn't. Why is it sometimes that the Quran doesn't seem very clear and we really have to put some effort into it? Yeah, think about that. Maybe there's something there. Maybe there's a point there, that it's not meant to be easy. It's meant to have you apply your mind to it. So the very purpose of Islam was again something that I felt was part of this element that was missing, this sense of a vacuum being there that needed to be filled. And I would suggest that to fill any such vacuum, the starting point has got to be education. You've got to be able to address difficulties in a rational way. This room is full of shining lights, but you know as well as I do that we don't have to look very far to see the complete opposite of this room, to see the complete antithesis, where there isn't education, there isn't understanding, there isn't rational thought. We need an education to form the foundations of our work. Because as well as helping us understand our religion, our function, it also helps us to understand our societies. Sometimes Muslims, I would suggest, are oblivious to the nature of the society they live in. They've got their Islam, they know how to apply it, that can be applied the same way whichever society they live in. Well, is that really correct? And has history shown that to be the case? We know that throughout the world Muslims dress in different ways, speak in different ways, pray in different ways. Isn't that instructive? How can we address the needs of a society unless we figured out that society? As I say, we're all educated people sat in this room. But we, amongst ourselves, when we have conversations, what do we say? We say, oh, you know what? Pakistan, if you go there, those 5-year-olds, they could sell you. These are the private conversations that we have. And you might use words like jalad or whatever, but the fact of the matter is we recognise that there's a difference in that society. And to be fair to them, they have to be street smart, street wise, because it's survival of the fittest. So they have to operate in a particular way. And we're used to operating in a different way. Because here when you go to the average shop, you don't expect to be ripped off by the guy behind the counter. And so you conduct yourself accordingly. Here you will happily queue. In Pakistan you won't even dream about queuing. These are the differences in different societies that we appreciate by our behaviour. But we need to appreciate if we want to do something as a Muslim. Appreciate the needs of this society and recognise, for example, that there's a lot of good in this society. It isn't all doom and gloom. And the fact that we've chosen to live here rather than anywhere else should, of course, be the best evidence of that. Education also helps to understand another aspect that too often we've ignored. PR, public relations. I often joke that Muslims can't even spell PR. Sadly, it's not a joke. What do we know, and often what do we care about public relations? Apart from complaining that the press coverage is against us, what do we really do to understand public relations and do something about it? Interestingly enough, this week, Bradford was a wonderful example. That article in the national papers about the synagogue in Bradford that was helped by Muslims. Now, I have no doubt that that was a very genuine, authentic effort to assist the Jewish community from Muslims. But the implications of that reverberate much further than Bradford. Can you imagine the effect of that story? If you're somebody, some Jewish person in North London who picks up that paper and, contrary to all your preconceived ideas, here are Muslims helping Jews. Imagine if you were a Muslim in some part of the country and you'd been brought up to think that, oh, Muslims and Jews are forever forsworn to be enemies, and you read this positive story. It's one incident, but the public relations aspect of it we need to be mindful of. It's instructive again and shows us what can be achieved by these tasks, these acts that in isolation wouldn't really amount to much. And perhaps the greatest sense of loss that I felt, and no doubt many of you feel, was for this reason. If you've had something before and you no longer have it, you feel the sense of loss. If you never had it in the first place, it's not quite the same. I may be wrong, and I certainly don't mean to be disrespectful, but I imagine Buddhists throughout the world aren't bemoaning the fact that they don't command a significant presence on the world stage. Because they never ran the show. They never did have any sort of empire. They never were looked up at in the same way as perhaps Muslims were. Let me move beyond that example of empires and Buddhism and world religions. Let's bring it a bit closer to home. And it might not be for very long that I can give this example, and so I'm going to enjoy it while I can. But right now, Liverpool are top of the league. That might not please everybody, but just bear with me for a moment. I want to enjoy this for a...
What's their famous song?
oh yeah, all sorts, but the ones that I can repeat. Liverpool are top of the league, but for 20 years they haven't won the league. And they've had to... Thank you very much, brother, for that.
Take your time on that point.
Oh, it's even longer now.
Give a 5-minute break, I think.
But for 20 plus years, they've watched whilst others, and predominantly Manchester United, have been winning the league with regularity. Now, in those 20 years, I'm pretty sure that the sense of loss has been greater for Liverpool than Everton. Any other team that never had it in the first place, never thought it was theirs, they're not bothered, they don't expect to win it. But Liverpool got to a stage where they were expecting to win it. Now, to be fair, the tables might turn now for Manchester United, who for the last 20 years have been expecting to win it every single year. When that doesn't happen, and please God it won't, the sense of loss is magnified. Now let's come back to Islam and recall our history. Not as some sort of exercise where we sit here and mutually reinforce how wonderful we were and slap each other on the back and say, wasn't it great 1,000 years ago? That doesn't achieve anything. But if we can gain some inspiration from our history, then it is an exercise worth doing. Because that was a time 1,000 years ago when that respect and dignity that I mentioned earlier was the default position. Right now, you can think of certain communities, and the first thing that comes into your mind about that particular community is, oh, they're always highly educated. Every single one of them educated. Oh, they're always successful, they get the best jobs, they're always in the top positions. Oh, they're always in the best positions in governments, in politics. But there was a time when that default position, they're always successful, they're always at the forefront of achievement, they're always educated. Well, that default position belonged to Islam and Muslims. Less than 100 years ago, the great Muslim poet Allama Iqbal, when he was writing his poetry, and again in an effort to inspire people, what example did he use? The example of Cordoba in southern Spain. But look, this is what you were, and look at what you are now, trying to get people to think again about what it was that made them successful. And one of the phrases that Iqbal used was that Islam was a religion for masters, not slaves. Now, what did he mean by that? That we should all pick up our weapons and go and try and become masters again? No, that's not what he was talking about. He was talking about the need to change our mindset, because you can be free but still have a slavish mentality. And that's what he was talking about. That these Muslims had been so used to being ruled by others now for hundreds of years that they didn't know how to truly act as free people. And this is the point, isn't it, of Islam? You are free as a human being to do whatever you want. Nothing grants you as much freedom as Islam. It tells you, by the way, if you do this, that might not be good for you, and there'll be consequences. But as a human being, you're free to do whatever you want. And that means free to soar. Free to set the example that you should be setting. Cordoba, 1,000 years ago, was the largest city in the world. Paris and London were dirty towns. In Cordoba, there was clean running water. There was street lighting. There were public libraries that were greater than any of the private collections in the rest of Europe. The rest of Europe didn't have public libraries. What you had was some very wealthy rulers who had their private collections. But the public libraries in Cordoba were greater than any of these private collections that the kings had for themselves. That was 1,000 years ago. And now, where are we? When everybody else is progressing, what are we discussing? I'll never forget, 20 odd years ago, shortly after I was called to the bar, a friend of mine who was at bar school with me went off to practice in Birmingham. And this was very early on in our careers, and he rang me up and said, "What are you doing this weekend? Why don't you come down? We'll all get together. There's some Muslim lads here, and we'll all sit and have a chat." And I thought, well, that's nice professional Muslim gathering. I'll go and join them. And I remember it was Saturday night, and there were about 5-7 of us in this room, and one of them started a discussion about should we be wearing ties as Muslims. I thought, okay. And this carried on. And the justification was that the tie is the sign of the cross. Well, it's not when I wear it. And I'll tell you now that my non-Muslim friends haven't got a clue about that being the reason they wear a tie. But this went on for some time, and I said to him, I said, "Brother, but do we really need to be discussing these things?" "Oh yes, brother, this is very important." I said, "But why? This is very important. I said, "Look, it's not important, in my humble opinion, but at the very least, we just spent half an hour discussing it. Don't you think that half an hour could have been better spent discussing something else, given what's happening to Muslims in the world?" And I'm pretty sure it's not because we all wear ties. And he didn't get the point. He thought this was a valid and important topic of discussion. The irony of it was that he was a solicitor, in fact, and then his phone rang, and it was the police station saying that one of his clients was down at the police station and he had to go. So he said, "Sorry brothers, I've got to go now." Pulled his tie out of his pocket, put it on. Wasting my time and your time, and is this what we've come to? And nowadays, Again, I might be wrong. Please feel free to tell me I'm wrong. But I don't think Muslims' main problem is the fact that they watch Peppa Pig. You know, there are those people who do have issues with Peppa Pig. I'm not one of them. My 2-year-old daughter is a big fan of Peppa's, in fact, and has probably got every Peppa-related item that she could get her parents to buy. But these are the problems that Muslims are facing in the world. Now, to be fair, some people operate at that level, and that's fine. I'm not going to unduly criticise them. But this is the Professional Muslims Institute. So it's taken for granted that people here are not only professional, but educated. And therefore, what I would suggest is that there's a responsibility on us to do something and to perhaps fill that vacuum. Individually, we need to be ambassadors. Now, being an ambassador doesn't mean just be nice to the non-Muslims and so that they go away with a nice impression of Islam. No. At times we do have to stand up and say, hang on, that's wrong. That's not what Islam's all about. That's not what what Muslims believe. And at times we do have to fight our corner, even as ambassadors. But there's two sides to being an ambassador. Fighting your corner, but also projecting the image that you want projected. And individually and collectively, I would suggest that for too long, we've not set the example that we should set. That's what Islam is. That's the purpose of Islam. It's for mankind, not a bunch of Pakistanis in Yorkshire or Lancashire. It's a guidance, a blessing, a mercy for humanity. And is that how we conduct ourselves? As a blessing for humanity? We do well if we're a blessing for our own family half the time, never mind humanity. Now, perhaps it wouldn't be important if the world was doing just fine. But look at what's happened in the world. The events of the last few years have shown that the other systems have brought the world to its knees. You look at Western-style capitalism, that unchecked capitalism that's brought world economies to their knees. Is there no space there for alternatives to be suggested? For some people to pipe up and say, hang on, you know what, we've got a system here that says you shouldn't be conducting your economy along those lines, and if you followed this system, you wouldn't have got yourself into that mess. Isn't there scope there for Muslims to contribute? What about values? We all complain about the excess of consumerism, especially in this run-up to Christmas. You go to the shops and people are fighting for things when they haven't got the money to buy them anyway, because consumerism is a religion in itself. Isn't there scope there for an alternative set of values to be taught to people? That look, maybe it's not all about what you can acquire, maybe it's not all about the material. In these areas, and they're just 2 areas out of however many, but isn't there scope there? Isn't there a space, a vacancy for someone or something to assume moral leadership in the world? And if not Islam, what? You have now every other person seems to be getting afflicted with cancer, and the same human mind that can condense a library into a tiny computer chip that can fit on your fingernail can't come up with a cure for cancer? Well, maybe it could if the funding wasn't going to weapons development. Maybe it could if all the most lucrative jobs weren't on Wall Street creating ridiculous financial instruments that don't benefit anybody but the select few. Maybe if that human potential was harnessed, then we would get cures for cancer. We would get economic systems that helped people rather than sucked the blood out of them. I would suggest that there is that vacancy. And right now, the time is ripe for Muslims to get a grip. Get a grip of themselves. find out about their own religion and why it was revealed and what it's meant to do to humanity, and attempt to create that moral leadership. The world certainly needs it. The only question is, can we provide it? You're welcome.
Zia, thank you for that phenomenal talk. You'll now have an opportunity to ask questions from Zia, either about his book or his talk today. I should probably introduce myself for those of you that don't know me. I've been coming that often that I presume everybody knows me by now. I'm Saida Ahmed, and I'm one of the PMI members, and I've been here probably, I feel like as if I'm kind of a piece of the furniture, but I've been supporting Javed in his work. Javed has done a phenomenal job in pulling PMI together, and occasionally people ask me, they go, so what is it that you're involved in with PMI? And I said, actually, I just do the little bits that I try to take away from Javed because he's doing so much. But I'm going to be comparing some of the questions for now anyway. So questions, comments? Naveed.
I would like to ask brother the question from a barrister standpoint, that does a separation of church and the state truly exist in the society? Although we have an illusion that it does. You are knowledgeable of the law, and does the English law creates this illusion of separation between the church and the state, or that separation truly exists?
Start off with an easy one, eh? I would suggest it exists to the extent that it needs to exist for this society, in this sense that people are all, on the face of it, regarded as equal before the law. And I think the role of a state is to provide that ground for the individual. Now, where I would say that religion can come into the law is not in the sense that the law should encroach on what is essentially a private matter, but on the topics I just mentioned recently, for example, economy, the way we conduct ourselves, because this is where I think Islam does promote religion being involved in law to a limited extent by having those values, those religious values, being part of the foundations of the law. Now, I think too often Muslims confuse that with, instead of just having the values permeating the laws and then you make the laws for a civil society, what we want is the religious people to be the lawyers, the religious people to be in charge, the laws to be overtly religious. I don't think that's what Islam is about. I think that in this society, the best example I would give is that what law is there that stops me being a Muslim? Prevents me from practicing my Islam? So in a society that says there's no, or rather there is a separation of church and state, what law is there, what aspect of legislation prevents me in any way practicing my Islam? Now, can I say the same for certain Muslim societies where they would say, oh, there's no separation of church and state in our religion. By the way, you practice your Islam in that way and you're going to end up in jail or worse. And so in this, I think this is I mean, I'm not an expert on church and state, and I don't want to be, but if I was to try and summarize what I would say the Islamic position was, it was to instill the laws, instill the values of Islam into the legal system. I hope that in some way answers your question.
The church and the state, the issue of secularism. When the church was oppressing the people, there was a battle that took between the thinkers, the intellectuals, and the church. And they came to a compromise that we would have secularism, where man would leave religion in his own house, in his own church or place of worship. Now, this was a problem in Europe. Now, this, after accepting this and implementing this system, secular system, this was exported to the Muslim world. Do you think that the secular system in the Muslim world is a problem, or is it a solution?
Any system in the Muslim world, if it's a blind imitation of others, is a problem. You can't take systems from other countries and just import them and say, well, because it worked in America, it's going to work in our country. It doesn't work like that. Any system has got to be homegrown, authentic, and going back to what I was saying earlier, understanding your society. If you're going to legislate for a particular society, you have to understand that society. And so, for example, we've seen the recent, democratic efforts in the Muslim world. Well, there's a whole spectrum, isn't there? So you have all kinds of different manifestations of democracy in the Muslim world. One aspect of it can be, oh, here's your candidate, you can vote for him, you've had a vote, you're happy, our man's in, that's democracy, Islamic style. But then you'll have other Muslim countries who say, well, that's a nonsense, and we've got proper systems, we've got parties, and they'll compete, they will vie for votes, just as we expect in the West. So this sort of importing something and imposing it, that's not going to work. Whether it's democracy, whether it's secularism, or anything else. Now, the secular example, yes, if you look at it from the West, we can see that, hang on, this is a particular response to a particular set of circumstances in the West. Now, your solution may well have been secularism. But again, by the same logic, it doesn't automatically follow that our solution in our country is going to have to be a secular one. And that's where I think Muslims can speak up and say, well, hang on, no, we've got these certain values, religious values, and however we might dress up our state, those values are going to permeate our society. So in that sense, I would say that, you could have a very westernized system, but as long as it's underpinned by Islamic values, I would say there's nothing wrong with that.
Answer? You'll have to speak really loud or come and speak
I'll
loud.
take the microphone, sorry.
I'm Sarah Lee, Manningham Housing Association. Brother Zia, first of all, I'm a Manchester United fan, so you give me an open goal.
I was going to mention
I'm going to ignore that open goal. But the question I've got for you, it relates to your point about, as a community, we're bad at PR. And I agree with that. The problem with PR is there's an expectation that we're going to positively promote ourselves, positively promote Muslims, and positively promote Islam. But there are some serious issues within the community that we're not good at tackling, we're not good at talking about. When I go to the mosque, I never hear anything about forced marriages. When I go to the mosque, I never hear anything about grooming. When I go to the mosque, I never hear anything about drug dealing. When I go to the mosque, I never hear about the fact that a disproportionate number of people are in prisons. So how do you get that balance right in terms of positively promoting community, but being comfortable and secure about talking about these serious issues that impact on the community? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very valid and good point. How do we strike that balance? I don't imagine there's any easy answer, to be perfectly honest. Before we get to the projection and PR stage, you've touched on an earlier stage that needs to take place, and that's the conversation that we need to have in the mosques. Now this is, again, I would suggest, and to be fair, some mosques are better at it than others, but the mosque needs to be more than that place where you go and you say your prayers. It needs to be the fulcrum of the community, as it used to be in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. They didn't just go to the mosque and then disperse after prayer time. That was where they did everything. The teaching was going on in the mosque. The planning, the strategy, everything was going on in the mosque. So it was very much a community centre rather than just a prayer facility. Nowadays, too often we take community centre to mean where we celebrate Pakistan Independence Day. It's got to be beyond that. But often I mean, this is where I'm going to get a little bit controversial.
Go for it.
Sometimes I think our religious leaders do what they know they can get away with. And if they know the congregation isn't going to turn around and question them, they'll carry on operating in a particular way. I once had a conversation with a rabbi in Liverpool, and he said to me, "Oh, your head judge, the recorder of Liverpool, he's Jewish?" And I said, "Yeah, I know." He said, "He comes to my synagogue." And I said, "Oh, does he?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "Oh, it's hard work when he comes." I said, "Why?" He goes, "Because he really listens properly to the sermon. Then he asks me questions. Well, what about this and what about that verse? Doesn't that verse say this?" And he really pulls me up on everything. I felt like saying to him, "You're the rabbi, mate. You're in charge. Tell you what, you come to our mosque." They won't ask you any questions. They won't even notice you're Jewish half the time. But they certainly won't ask you any questions. We don't do questions. But this is the thing, if the congregation, and it comes back to education, doesn't it? The congregation is going to ask questions if it's not educated enough to ask questions. If the congregation doesn't ask questions, the religious leader isn't obliged to answer them or address them. And so, I would say we start with our function. We're educated, we know a little bit. Well, let's start to ask some questions. Pretty soon, the religious leader, if he wants to stick around and carry on getting his salary, he's going to have to equip himself to answer those questions, because you get the leaders you deserve. If you deserve better and he can't provide better, well, you have to replace him with a religious leader who can. And to be fair, around the country there are mosques now where there are religious leaders who don't just do it, old school style. They will engage with their congregation, they will engage especially with the younger people, and try as best they can to answer questions. And that's where you start getting the discussion about forced marriage, about grooming, about drugs, whatever else the conversation needs to be. And then you'll find, for example, how often do we see a story, a negative Muslim story on the news, in the news, and the guy who's got the microphone, you think, "Oh God, it's the wrong guy with the mic." And you think, no, you don't want him as a spokesman. But you have the committee, and the committee will at best propose him as the spokesman. Now, can you imagine that happening in certain other communities? I'm sure they would say, hang on, not anybody can speak on behalf of the mosque. We have a press officer. And not anybody can be a press officer. He has to have training and a grounding in being able to answer questions. So coming back to the PR point, the guy who actually does attempt to do something on the PR front is trained to do PR. And this is where, again, education, society, understand the society that you're dealing with. Because one of the things we pride ourselves on, and rightly pride ourselves on, is there is no religious hierarchy in Islam. At the end of the day, if you know how to conduct a janazah prayer, you can conduct a janazah prayer. It's as simple as that. Now, this lack of formality on the one hand is great, but on the other hand, in a society that's very formal and very organized, and they expect to be able to go to the guy for the answer, sometimes it can be a disadvantage. And that's where we need to start to understand the society and say, right, you know what, Muslims, yeah, we do need to have dedicated press officers who can act as our spokespeople. Otherwise, you get any kind of lunatic who, and to be fair, the media love the lunatics. Makes for good viewing. They'll happily give them the mic. So we need to address that. Again, hope that addresses some of the issues you've raised.
So, right, we've got two people, one right at the back, but then one person over here. So,
Yes. Add what you just said now. We've got a large organisation called
can you just sort of speak up a bit?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Right. We have an organisation called the Muslim Council of Britain. I think they were supposed to be so-called the spokesman for the UK. Do you think they have to as well?
I'm very reluctant, brother, to be perfectly honest, I'm very reluctant to condemn individual organisations, because you're never going to get that one organisation that speaks for everybody. It's just not going to happen. But
No answer to your question, and there's no unity then, is there?
There isn't, or there's definitely no unity, and that I would criticise.
That's our downfall, really.
It is, and one thing I would, if I could just expand on that, one thing we need to learn to do is to disagree with each other. Why is it? Why is it that when we meet somebody who practices their Islam in a particular way, suddenly we shun that person? Hang on, isn't he just as much Muslim as me? okay, when he prays, he's got something on his head, I don't. He might hold his hands differently to me, but does that, in the eyes of God, make him any less Muslim than me? We need to learn to accept each other's viewpoints. And when we do that, you'll find, I would suggest, that once we start doing that as individuals, then the organisations, they're on less strong footing as well to say, we don't do things that way, we don't have anything to do with them. Hopefully they'll come together. It might be a bit of an optimistic hope, but yes, unity and lack of is definitely the problem.
Just one little point, and I think that what I'm saying is that also what my worry is that we have distracted our young Muslim away. We're drifting apart. I believe that's very important.
I think, again, brother, you're absolutely right. Yeah, if I was a youngster growing up and I was told, oh, by the way, you're this type of Muslim and that type of Muslim doesn't have anything to do with that type of Muslim and you don't go to that mosque, etc., etc., you'd think, you know what, better off without.
Thank you. This person here.
Abdul Iftikhar, Cameron Solicitors in Leeds. A two-pronged question. Firstly, Zia, what motivated you to write Your Average Muslim? And secondly, what message does it actually convey?
Thank you very much for that question. I'd almost forgotten about the book.
Just bring you back on track.
No, you should be my agent, yes. It is available, signed, £10, please. What motivated me to write it? Initially, it was my children. I have 3 very young children, and as any parent, you start to think, what sort of world are they going to grow up in, and how easy is it going to be for them to be a Muslim? I, alhamdulillah, had it very easy. I had a family that made it easy. My father was very relaxed about things, but knew his stuff, and conveyed Islam in a way that didn't involve a stick. And so that was always a bonus. And because I grew up in that relaxed environment, that made me into the type of Muslim I am. But also there weren't the same Muslim issues in the headlines that there are now. And so that made it easier for me as well. But I think that even though I try to be relaxed at home, it might be that my children are already, I have a 7-year-old who says, Daddy, why are Muslims always fighting? Why are the problems always in Muslim countries? And he's 7 now. And the danger is that if he doesn't get answers, is he going to take one of 2 courses which are both damaging? 1, he might just abandon Islam. Or 2, he might say that, you know what, we've got some real problems, we need to band together and become radicalized. So, as part of this thought process, I thought that maybe I should provide them with some sort of guidance and something that reflects my experiences as well. So that's how I started to write the book. But then as I began the process, I realized, you know what, there are so many issues here that need to be covered. And there's such a huge audience for this. So the book covers the history of not just me as an individual, but the Islamic history that I've mentioned, the scientific achievements, the success story that was Cordoba, the question of whether you can either be religious or scientific, because that's something that a lot of non-Muslims think that, you can't be both. So I try and address that. There's one chapter devoted to that, to say that, listen, you can be absolutely both. Yeah, it's the dullest chapter to some people, but it's there. But also, I tried to flag up certain areas for the future, so certain areas that I think my children need to be thinking about and others need to be thinking about. And for non-Muslims, what I'm saying is that, look, there is thinking going on in the Muslim world. And for my own children, I'm saying that maybe these are the things you need to think about. So that is really the motivation behind it. But then in terms of what's the message for it, the message, I would say, is the Islamic message of optimism. It seems like doom and gloom when you look at what's happening in the world and you think that, what's the way out of this? But Islam isn't about pessimism. Islam is about you knuckle down, you carry on doing your bit, and everything will come good. And I firmly believe, and I think the tenor of the book is that if we do what we're supposed to do, then we've got nothing to fear. God doesn't judge us on results, He judges us on our intentions and our efforts. And hopefully that answers.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Just one more question, and then if people want to ask individually after that, Uncle Akram, you haven't
Yes, give the elderly a chance.
No, I have a question.
I'm just delighted that you wrote the book, because reading it made a lot of sense, and it's going to be a great help to future generations as well. And I hope that everybody in this room, as you say, educated, read and write their own perspective on how best to resolve the challenges that we face. A couple of things that have come up in questions. One is about young people today and how they can get confused. But from where I stand, I see a lot of you as young people having grown in stature. And I'm so proud when I see all of you doing so much more than my generation did. We were into no questions. You are into questioning. And that is growing up. And I hope that you will continue with that. And I hope that everybody in this room will take that message from your book, because it's all about asking questions. And Allah says in the Quran quite clearly, ponder, reflect, think. Those who know are better than those who don't know. And I think that really is not radicalizing anybody. It's not fighting the world in which we live. It's fighting ourselves to make sure that we are respectful, respected, dignified, and project ourselves in a way where we're not fearful. My generation was always fearful of the ulama. I know personally, I never questioned people in the mosque. I never questioned them. Imam was Imam. And even when I disagreed, I didn't have the courage. You have that courage. MashaAllah, may Allah bless you. I hope all of you will continue having that courage to step up and face the challenges in the way you are, and carry on improving the lives of not only Muslims, but improving the lives of, at the end of the day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent us to this part of the world for one thing only, as you say in your book, and that not just to worship Him, but to pass His message, to make sure that guidance is spread around to all those people who have absolutely no idea what Islam is about. So well done. Thank you very much. May Allah bless you. And sorry that an old man has had to put his two pennies worth in here.
Thank you very much, Uncle. But the one thing